Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 5th of September of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, of course, we're going to start with the battle for Robotyne, the small settlement that located on the south of Orekhov and on the north of Tokmak. Today we had a lot of very interesting details and updates from these territories, so let's start step by step. Probably the most interesting and the most important updates of today is that the Ukrainians, as a result of fierce clashes, as a result of storming and assault operation, managed to establish control over the Russian fortification area that located on the north of Novoprokopovka and on the south of Robotyne. So basically, as a result of fierce clashes, the Ukrainians did establish control over this territory. And this is probably one of the most important stronghold, one of the most important fortification that we can find in this area. And I have a very big question how the Russians managed to give this territory under Ukraine control. Because if we increase the number of updates, for example, since the 27th of August, we have already discussed this foothold. For example, this is the map of the hills, and this is Robotyne in the middle. And as you can see, basically, as a result of some actions, the Ukrainians managed to capture the hill. This is the hill, and this is probably the highest position on the south of Robotyne and the highest position when we're talking about Novoprokopovka, the settlement that located on the south. And if Ukrainians are able to hold this territory and to save control, they will be able to see everything that take place, every single forces, tank, armored vehicle that located in Novoprokopovka. This is a very big problem for the Russians currently, and furthermore, a few days ago we also discussed this defense belt, and this is the photo of this defense belt. On this photo you can see not the positions that Ukrainians managed to capture, but positions that located on the left side of the road that connects Robotyne and Novoprokopovka. And these fortifications are under Russian control, but as I understand, the level of fortifications is the same under Ukrainian forces. So starting this morning, the Russians, as soon as they realized that these positions were captured by the Ukrainians, they start bombing and shelling and attacking the Ukrainians with FPV drones. There were a lot of videos, geolocated videos. The Russians published up to 10 videos, and as a result of those attacks, of those FPV drone strikes, a lot of Ukrainians were wounded and probably killed. We will not watch these videos because as a result of those clashes, there were a lot of casualties among soldiers and a lot of violence. And as you know, we condemn any violence in the world. The only thing video you can watch is that how the Ukrainians managed to destroy another light vehicle that was located on the northern part of that fortifications. So that was the problem. This is the problem. And somewhere at noon time, at 5 p.m. of the local time, we start receiving updates that the Russians launched a counter-offensive operation. First updates we got is that the Russians, as a result of counterattack, managed to capture entire Robotyne and to force the Ukrainians to step back. But from the beginning, I didn't believe those pieces of news, and later we got more details, more clarifications that as a result of counter-offensive operation, the Russians managed to restore control over the central, let's say over the western part of Robotyne. So the question is which direction the Russians used for that attack, and as I understand, the Russians were attacking in this direction, in direction of Robotyne, from these fortifications, and as a result of that attack, for some period of time, the Russians managed to capture a few streets and to restore control over the central part and the western part of the settlement. And what is the purpose of that attack? Some sources are saying that the Russians launched counter-offensive operation to force the Ukrainians to step back, but I have completely different opinion, and my opinion is that the Russians, no matter what, no matter the losses, they need to return control over the stronghold that the Ukrainians managed to capture during the previous 24 hours, and to attack this stronghold in front is a suicide operation, and the Russians know this. So the only possible solution that the Russians can do, at least to reduce their losses, is to attack from the west, to enter the western part of Robotyne, and basically to establish fire control, or at least to cut the possibilities for the Ukrainian forces in the southern part to have rotation, to get supply and support. So basically to encircle this territory at least for some period of time, because we know that the central part of Robotyne, or the territory that was recaptured by the Russians is completely reduced to ruins. There are no places to hide. There are no places where the Russians can have their positions, because basically the Russians themselves during the previous weeks reduced to ruins the entire settlement. And that was the purpose, to enter this area and to cut the Ukrainians from the north. And now, as soon as the Russians were able to do this, they can continue their offensive operation, and they can storm the stronghold, their own stronghold, now at least from three directions: from the south, from the southwest, and from the northwest. And as I understand, this is exactly what the Russians are trying to complete right now. They need to return, and if they're able to do, then they can win some time to complete rotation, to dig in deeper, and to wave the next waves of attacks from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, to complete this operation, the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians on the north, because as I understand, when the Russians were attacking in the western part of Robotyne, the Ukrainians launched their own flank counterattack and to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to create a cauldron on the south. And the Russians saw everything, and of course they did their best not to allow the Ukrainians to counterattack in the Russian flank. From the other side, we also saw that the Ukrainians continue attacking the Russian positions in Novoprokopovka using FPV drones. As a result of those attacks, some ammo depots, warehouses, some Russian positions were damaged. Furthermore, there was more attacks using HIMARS systems, and you know that I was very surprised. Every single blue icon with explosion is the icon of HIMARS strike, and I was very surprised today, or for example, not today. I start being very surprised probably since the beginning of August. You know that the difference between the Russians and the Western countries in Ukraine, that for example, the Russians are not using Iskanders against, let's say, D-20 howitzer. The Russians are not using Iskanders against, let's say, a small car, or let's say a small building somewhere among the fields. But the Ukrainians sometimes use HIMARS to attack even, let's say, a group of infantry, 2-3 soldiers that walk just along the fields. And we see that, and this explains a lot, because now the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to move their artillery systems closer to the combat line, because the Russians probably have some artillery superiority. And the only thing that Ukrainians can do is to attack the Russian artillery systems with HIMARS from untouchable distance, from the distance that the Russians can get with their regular artillery systems. But from one side, of course, probably this is a good tactic, but from another side, we see that sometimes the Ukrainians are forced to use HIMARS missiles against just regular howitzers like D-20, D-30, which is probably cheaper than a regular AK-47 weapon or something like this. So anyway, the point is that the Ukrainians were trying during the day to suppress the Russian artillery using HIMARS missiles. They were attacking, of course, the Russians from the hidden positions, and the main purpose of that is to suppress the Russian artillery, to allow the Ukrainian forces to get their own artillery systems as close as possible, and after that to continue supporting their offensive forces in direction of Verbova and to the south of Novoprokopovka. The Russians have not just the artillery superiority, the Russians have also anti-tank superiority. Today, for example, the Russians published at least one video and one photo showing destroyed not Leopard but Challenger. And of course, now we can say that there is a joke that Challenger, the second, haven't managed to pass its first challenge on the territory of Russian Federation. That was, you can see on the video, the first Challenger that was destroyed by the Russian anti-tank missile, and the second Challenger on photo we can see also somewhere among the fields of Robotyne, probably closer in direction of Verbova, where the Ukrainians also try to attack and also try to develop their offensive operation in direction of the settlement. And today the Russians made a significant number of drone bombings, of artillery strikes against advancing Ukrainian soldiers who were trying to get as close as possible to Verbova, and of course the main purpose is to capture at least few buildings and to establish a stable foothold in the west-northern part of the settlement. But the Russians were bombing, the Ukrainians Ukrainians with all types of weapons, including FAB bombs, and for example, another interesting update regarding FAB bombs. For example, today the Russians published the first photo of FAB1500 with the guided equipment. So the Russians have already passed the test period, and now they are able to use their guided bombs not just with FAB500 or FAB250, but also with FAB1500. And as we understand, this is not just like significant weapon with significant damage. This is a real game changer. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that they're able to they have managed to increase the distance of FAB1500. So we expect the appearance of this type of weapon on the combat line, and of course this will change the game obviously. Furthermore, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported, as usual, in the first days of every month of each month, he provided his own numbers regarding the situation, and he reported that as a result of clashes, since the beginning of the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation, the Ukrainians lost around 66,000 of soldiers and more than 7,600 armored vehicles and different types of weapons. So the Ukrainians had significant losses, and they probably lost more than 60% of their 9th and 10th military corps. So we'll see what is going to be next, but when talking about this frontline war more time, as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost during the previous 24 hours another 170 soldiers, and currently the Russians are trying to encircle the fortifications on the south and to try to return. And one more time, we will finish with this. As soon as the Russians are able to return control, as I understand, they will leave the central and the western part of Robotyne, because there is no need to control this territory, but there is a very high risk to lose the entire front line if they are not able to return control over the fortifications that located on the north of Novoprokopovka. Now we are moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, and today we got also significant number of different types of updates. Today the Ukrainians at 4 a.m. of the local time launched another wave of offensive operation in direction of Novodonetsk. The Ukrainians were attacking from Zolotaya Niva in direction of that settlement. Also, the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions from Prichistovka in direction of Novomayorska, and some attempts or reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat took place from Vodyana in direction of Mykolska. So the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians in 3 directions. We haven't received nothing from Shevchenkova and Pavlovka, but I expect that the Ukrainians will make attempts to attack these settlements as well. So, but the Russians, according to the soldiers on the ground, officers on the ground, reported that they managed to discover the concentration of Ukrainian forces a long time before they launched that attack. And basically, when the Ukrainians started their movement, the Russians started bombing and shelling them with multiple rocket launch systems, with artillery systems, with all types of weapons they have. And as a result of those counterattacks from the Russian side, some Ukrainian convoys and attempts to attacks were repelled and were forced to stop at the beginning of that process, and they were forced to step back at many directions. But no matter the situation, of course, some Russian sources confirms that as a result of attack at some positions, the Russians were forced to step back, and I suppose that the Russians are talking about the settlement by the name of Novodonetsk. For example, today we got another video of another attempt of Ukrainian forces to make a tank rush and to penetrate the Russians' defense belt with at least 2 tanks. They were trying to attack the Russians in Novodonetsk from direction of Makarovka. There at least a few armored vehicles were involved in that operation. At some point of time, we see that one Ukrainian tank got on minefields and it stopped. Then another tank tried to bypass it and to continue attacking further, and he got on another mine. So there was a very fierce clashes, very fierce battles, and one more time, probably the Russians were forced to step back from Novodonetsk. But if you remember the beginning of June, when the Ukrainians just launched their first attempts, first offensive operation in direction of Novodonetsk, the Russians have already the Russians used the same tactic in June already. For example, when the Ukrainians entered Novodonetsk, and if you remember, they managed to enter, and there was like videos of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles inside the settlement, the Russians took a decision to step back in direction of Novomayorsk. After that, the Russians launched significant artillery attacks against the Ukrainian positions in the settlement, and when the Ukrainians were defeated and were forced to step back, basically the Russians returned back in direction of Novodonetsk. So I won't be surprised if the Russians currently are trying to implement the same situation. So the battle for the South Donetsk area has begun one more time, another one. So we'll see who is going to win this time and whether the Ukrainians are able to penetrate the Russians' defense belt and to force them to step back. Interesting details and updates are coming from Nikolska, from this area, from Vuhledar direction, because if you remember, since the beginning of September, the Russians bomb and attack the coal mine and the industrial area in the vicinity of Vadiana for many times. The Russians were bombing this settlement with artillery strikes, with missiles, with guided bombs, and probably now we understand the real purposes of those attacks, because this is a perfect area to hide armored vehicles, to hide manpower, just to concentrate forces before the next wave of attack. The Russians probably got the intelligence information, and after that they started attacking. But anyway, maybe that was not enough. Those attacks weren't enough, and the Ukrainians launched some reconnaissance in force, and some few armored vehicles during that attack that took place today were destroyed. Furthermore, the Russians made also another missile strike between Vuhledar and Pavlovka, trying to probably to destroy the final forces, the last forces in this area. Anyway, the attack in this direction was also repelled by the Russian forces. As a result of clashes in the South Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost another 175 armored soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. As you can see, the level of losses is very heavy, and at least in comparison with the previous days, the level of losses is bigger. When talking about Novomikhailivka, the Russians, no matter the situation in Zaporozhye, on the Bradley Square in South Donetsk, tried to penetrate the Ukrainians' defense belt and to storm Novomikhailivka. Today they published a very interesting video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions from the south of Novomikhailivka, another checkpoint, another stronghold, and they tried to suppress and to pin down the Ukrainians, and maybe we need to expect some attempts to storm this area. Furthermore, there were attacks against the Ukrainian positions using the Lemur missiles from helicopters, from hidden positions of helicopters, and we got another destroyed fuel depot somewhere in Konstantinovka. The Russians destroyed the area that Ukrainians were using to support and supply their forces before the beginning of the next attempt to attack. So a lot of details, a lot of updates. Now we're moving to Klishchiivka area, because we also got a lot of updates from this territory. We haven't seen any movements on the ground. There were no movements neither from the Russians nor from the Ukrainian side, but today we got a lot of drone strikes. The Ukrainians destroyed a lot of artillery systems. So the previous days there was like active phase of Ukrainian attack when they sent a lot of infantry, a lot of tanks. The Russians repelled most of those attacks. At some points the Russians were forced to step back, and we're talking about the railways between Andreevka and Kurdyumovka. But those attacks that Ukrainians tried to implement gave them at least something very important. They received information. They received lots of geolocations, a lot of positions of Russian forces, and after that they started bombing. At least today the Ukrainians start bombing and attacking the Russian Grad systems, artillery systems, local ammo depots, warehouses. For example, this is another case when the Ukrainians were forced to use HIMARS weapon against just a regular Grad, probably with basic configuration. So imagine yourself that you need to use a very expensive missile against just a regular machine and very old Soviet machine. And one more time, this is another confirmation that the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to move their artillery, short-range artillery like M777 howitzer and so on, Palladians and so on, to the combat line, because basically they would be destroyed immediately by the Russian counter-artillery fire. Also, the Ukrainians, after they were forced to leave the forest and that located along the railways, they started bombing and attacking the Russian positions with FPV drones. We will not watch these videos because of casualties and violence against the people. And the Russians from their side established full control over Ivanovska, and there were also a lot of drone strikes published by the Sudoplatov drone squad, a lot of losses from the Ukrainian side, and so on. More details we got finally from Zaliznianska, from this territory, and today the Russian sources published the video, let's say aftermath, let's say after Zaliznianska battle situation. There was like an interview of a soldier who took part in that operation, and he told that he lost his drone somewhere in the forest, and after the battle situation he was searching his drone, and basically he found, as you can see on this video, he found the Ukrainian tank that was abandoned by the Ukrainians, the tank, and he basically destroyed the tank with anti-tank weapon and ran away. Anyway, that means that this territory is gray zone, because after he destroyed the tank, he took a decision to run away. But anyway, there are no longer Ukrainians in this forest. There are only Russians, if there are anyone there, and the Ukrainians, probably to be more precise, the forces of 30th Mechanized Brigade, were forced to step back after failed attempt to capture this settlement, this part of the forest. As a result of clashes on Donetsk directions, the Ukrainians lost another 225 soldiers and 11 armored vehicles. We haven't received almost nothing from Kupiansk and Liman front lines. The only important update that we need to pay attention to is that the Ukrainians managed to restore the bridge that located in the vicinity of settlement Sinkova. This is the Ukrainians published the video how their car was driving, and after that they entered the bridge that was destroyed. Anyway, there are a lot of ways how the Ukrainians can supply and support their forces in this area, and yet the Russians stopped any attempts to advance, to force it to capture, to attack, to counterattack, whatever. So for now there is a small operational pause. The Ukrainians today, for example, also published very interesting detail that they started mining process of the border, heavy mining of the border in Kazachye Lagery, Zalachov. So they start mining the territory between Kharkiv and Belgorod, as if the Ukrainians expect like the Russian attempt to attack in this direction. But yet we also haven't received any evidence or visual confirmations of this plan from the Russian side, just from the Ukrainian side. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.